Hey there, welcome to SI Now. It is Tuesday, November 22nd, and I'm Maggie Gray. You might forgive Bill O'Brien if he started ranting like Kanye. The Texans coach was upset yet reserved after referees either missed or botched 3 calls in Houston's loss to the Raiders. For more on the Monday night game from Mexico City, here's Ryan Aselta with Super Bowl champion Chris Canty.
All right, Chris, the NFL made its return to Mexico last night, playing its first game in Mexico City in over a decade. The Raiders knocked off the Texans 27-20 in a game that really had some serious issues all around. Houston QB Brock Osweiler seemed to be targeted with a green laser throughout the game. Osweiler admitted afterwards that the laser, it distracted him, was right in his face. There were paper airplanes being thrown. Air quality had been a concern. Security had been a concern going into this game. Overall, now that the trip is over, was the trip to Mexico City a success or failure for the NFL?
They got a great game out of it, and the Oakland Raiders and the Houston Texans really went at it last night. Certainly the Raiders got the best of the Texans in that matchup. But when you start pointing to those security issues, you don't want that to affect the entertainment product on the field. And I think there's some logistics in terms of moving a game off-site out of the country into Mexico City, a place that you don't traditionally have games. But I think all in all, the NFL did a solid job of being able to pull this off, trying to expand the game beyond the borders. And of course, south of the border in Mexico is a great opportunity. But time will tell whether it's been successful in terms of being able to market our game to the Mexican people.
No question. The support seemed to be there. The fans were there. But going down the road, should the NFL go back to Mexico City?
Well, I think you've got to continue to do it. You've got to have some consistency, some more touch points in the marketplace to be able to determine the interest there. But I think that they'll continue to do that over the course of the next few years with the international series there and in London. And they'll see where they're at. They'll be able to assess it after they have a larger sample size.
Talked about the distractions, the green laser in Osweiler's face, some of the other things going on. A distraction that really affected the game were the referees, who blew a gigantic call in the first quarter of this game. DeAndre Hopkins tiptoed the sideline, should have been a touchdown. Instead, the refs blew the whistle, ruled it dead, and it was unreviewable. Chris, this has been an ongoing theme all season. Why are the referees having so much trouble getting it right?
I don't know. The zebras strike again, and I'm tired of talking about the referees not getting the calls right. I think the National Football League has the resources to be able to make the right decision in terms of how to protect the integrity of the game in officiating. If it needs to add another official and make it 8 officials, then go ahead and do that. If you need to expand instant replay to include certain penalties, then do that. I understand it's a pace of play concern. You don't want to slow down the product, and the fans that are at home watching it, the fans that are in the stands watching it, you want to make sure that's an enjoyable experience for them. But you owe it to the players, you owe it to the members of the clubs, and ultimately you do owe it to the fans to make sure that you protect the integrity of the game when it comes to the officiating.
The referees, especially in this situation, though, Chris, they have to know, don't blow the whistle. Replay is there to make sure that they get it right. The second they blow the whistle and say Hopkins stepped on the sideline, that play is dead and everything else is null and void, right?
You know what? That's a great point. And I think you got to look at the officials in terms of not being full-time employees. They don't have the opportunity to work on their craft throughout the course of the week like NFL players and coaches do. And so you see a few missed calls in those situations. I think if they had the opportunity to continue to work on their craft, not only during the football season, but in the offseason, when teams are at OTAs, when teams are at mini camps, when teams are at training camps, going in there and practicing their officiating, I think we'd see a cleaner game. I think players would have a better idea of how referees are going to call games, and you'd see less penalties. That's a theory I think that the NFL needs to try to explore.
You know, Roger Goodell's talked about pace of play. You mentioned possible full-time refs. Is the league doing all they can to make sure these games are officiated at the highest level?
No, absolutely not. And I don't think that the NFL can argue that. Roger Goodell is saying that if he felt that full-time officials would make it a better game, then he would do it. I don't necessarily agree that that's the case. I think that everybody would say, obviously, if the more opportunities that you have to do something, the better at it you're going to be, officiating included. So I think that that will be a step in the right direction for the National Football League. And even if it doesn't change anything, the optics of it is better. It lets you know as a fan, as a player, as a coach, that the NFL is doing everything that they can to protect the integrity of our game.
I think a lot of fans, a lot of Texans fans agree with Chris today. Maggie?
My next guest is one of the greatest race car drivers of all time, and you can learn even more about his life in the new book, Jeff Gordon, His Dream, Drive, and Destiny. Jeff Gordon is here. So good to talk with you, and congratulations on this book. Really an impressive book, almost coffee table-like in a lot of ways. The foreword is written by Tom Cruise, and he says the movie Days of Thunder that he starred in really, amped up the popularity of NASCAR in the 90s. I think people look back at the golden ages of NASCAR. It's really the 1970s and the 1990s. What's the state of the popularity of the sport right now, Jeff?
Well, it's still hugely popular. I really think there's probably as many or more eyes on the sport today because of social media and different ways to access the information. But yeah, there's no doubt. There's been some races where attendance has not been what we've seen in the past, or viewership. But I think the sport's more exciting with the format and the way that the championship, just like what we just saw with Jimmie Johnson winning it and all that drama at the end with Carl Edwards and Joey Logano. But so in that sense, I think the sport's at the best place it's ever been as far as entertainment and excitement. But, I think we got to take a little bit of a reset and go back and say, okay, because I remember when I came along in the early 90s, it was, how do we all work together to do everything we can to grow this sport? And there was a lot of growth that was happening. And I think now we're at a place where we've got to reset and say, okay, what can we do again, to get ourselves back where it once was? And we've seen this happening with a lot of other sports. It's happening just in general with programming. And so it's a challenge, but it's one I feel confident that NASCAR will overcome.
There's so much in the book about really how you transcended the sport, became so mainstream, and really broke through. Really haven't had another driver do that besides Danica. Why do you think we haven't seen that crossover?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I just came into it and got a lot of great opportunities. And because I was from California, from open wheel racing, I just looked at it differently. And I luckily had some people surrounding me that looked at it differently and said, okay, instead of taking you down the traditional NASCAR driver path, let's take you outside of that and do something different. And our sponsors viewed it that way. Our PR looked at it that way. And because of that, some very cool things came along. I mean, being in People Magazine, Saturday Night Live, co-hosting with Kelly and filling in for Regis and doing things like that. And all of a sudden, the sport's growing at the same time all these other things are happening. So I just felt like it was just taking these moments and the success on the track and trying to help grow the sport and as well as my own brand.
You get really personal in this book, or the book, it's not written in the first person, it's written in the third person, but it gets very personal about that sort of time in your life after the divorce from your first wife, where you're talking about People Magazine, Sexiest Man, Saturday Night Live, all of these things. You were able to really not only embrace, but almost in some ways seek out this major fame and yet still be one of the top drivers in the sport, if not the top. How did you do that? And what advice can you give to other athletes who, want to become these big crossover stars yet still want to succeed in their sport?
Well, first of all, you have to have the success on the field or on the track, because if you don't have that, it's not going to just come on its own. There are certain drivers out there and people in sports that are very popular because of their personality or they bring something unique, and you don't have to back that up on the racetrack, but most of the time you're going to have to do that. But, you just have to look at what your brand is or who you are as a person and what you bring that's unique and special and try to push that and hope that it catches on with somebody. With social media these days, you can do a lot of that. It is interesting you bring up the divorce. I mean, I had a certain popularity success, through the mid-90s to 2001 and won my last championship 2001. But my popularity didn't get as high as it was until the controversy, that came from the divorce. And so, I had to make sure I stayed true to myself, work hard as a race car driver, and try to ride that, that tough time in my life. But luckily, I came out on the other side better and more popular.
Yeah. You also mentioned that during this time, the post-divorce, is when you became really good friends with Jimmie Johnson. It had been hard for you to let other drivers get close to you because you're competitive by nature. But Jimmie was the man, and you guys really had some good times together. Well, it was good to be Jeff Gordon and Jimmie Johnson for a big time there.
It was. Well, it's still good to be Jimmie Johnson.
He just won his seventh
sure did.
Cup championship.
But yeah, I mean, I never really created a friendship within the sport, and Jimmie, I saw him as this great young talent. He was coming to Hendrick Motorsports, so we were fortunate, to have him coming on board. But we started just hanging out a lot together and having a good time up here in New York. As a matter of fact, he met his wife now, Chandra, here in New York. I met my wife, Ingrid, up here in New York. So we had some good times traveling, not just around the U.S., but around the world. And then we had to start racing together and competing against one another, and that created some challenges, but we're still great friends.
Yeah, Paris St. Bart sounded like it was pretty good there.
Wasn't bad.
Can you make the case right now that Jimmie Johnson is the best driver ever?
I would certainly say so, because of my experience racing against him in the same equipment, in the same organization, Hendrick Motorsports, and there was one particular year, 2007, we had that team beat, the 24 car. We won a couple races. We had them down, and I thought, man, we've got this thing, and they just rallied back like they've always done, and put us away. And so, to me, as tough as the competition is today, and this format that we have with the playoff type system, to me, it's harder to win championships now than it's ever been. And yet they continue to rise up and get it done when it matters most. So, yeah, I think he's the best I've ever raced against. Right
now, he's tied with Dale Earnhardt and Petty for the most ever. How many more can he win, though? I mean, would it just be 8 to break the record, or could you see him getting all the way up to 10?
I mean, I just don't know if he's going to drive long. I mean, if he decided to do like what Mark Martin did and drive into his 50s, then yeah, I think he could get there. I think anything is possible with he and this team. I mean, they do extraordinary things like they did this year. Nobody had them pegged to win the championship this year, and yet here they are getting number 7, and creating history. I think he's definitely going to get 8. I think he'll definitely get 8. I think he's going to be that driven to separate himself from Richard and from Dale, and be known as the only 8-time champion.
It's been fun to watch, that's for sure. As for you, well, we thought you had your last lap, so to speak, Jeff, but then you come back. 8 races, 2 top 10 finishes, so congratulations. Filling in for Dale Jr. What did those races give you this year?
Well, it was a great experience for me on a lot of different levels, because I went in the Fox booth calling the races. So they had made some changes to the cars this year. So it was great to get back in there and remind myself of how intense the competition is out there, how tough it is, how hard you have to work. So it'll make me better at my job up in the booth next year with Fox. But also my interaction in my role at Hendrick Motorsports allowed me, I think, to get closer to the people within the organization by filling in for Dale, and actually build a stronger bond with Dale Jr. as well. So it was a great experience all the way around. Yeah, I would like to have gone a little bit better, even though we finished 6th in the last race at Martinsville. I would love to have given those guys a win.
Well, we know this, Jeff. Now, if you say you're done, we're not going to believe you, because you came back and you were driving at such an elite level.
I'm not going to believe myself.
Still, okay. So we mentioned we were talking about your beginnings as open wheel racing. Is the Indy 500 something that's on your bucket list?
It certainly was at one time. I love that race. I wanted to be my heroes growing up were Indy 500 champions like A.J. Foyt and Rick Mears and Johnny Rutherford. So I thought maybe that was on the horizon for me, but no, it's not now. I think I fulfilled so many of my goals through NASCAR, racing at Indianapolis and winning the Brickyard 400. But I would like to drive some other types of race cars. So I'm not retired completely, but it's just going to be something that makes sense and is interesting to me.
Okay. Well,
but Indy cars, I just don't. I have too much respect for those cars and what they're capable of doing, and how difficult it would be without having the proper amount of time in the car.
We can respect that. Jeff, congratulations on the book. Jeff Gordon, His Dream Drive, Destiny. It's available now wherever books are sold.
The top 5 in this week's SI.com Heisman Watchlist starts with Washington quarterback Jake Browning at number 5. Browning threw for over 330 yards and 2 touchdowns in Washington's bounce-back win against Arizona State. A newcomer on the list at number 4 is Stanford running back Christian McCaffrey, who ran all over Cal for 284 yards. He's averaging nearly 190 rushing yards per game in his last 4. Alabama freshman QB Jalen Hurts stays at number 3. He threw 3 touchdowns in a win over Chattanooga. He now has 7 TD passes to 1 pick the last 2 weeks. Second on the list remains Oklahoma quarterback Baker Mayfield. Ran for 2 and threw 2 touchdowns in a 28-point victory against West Virginia. And despite the loss to Houston last week, Louisville QB Lamar Jackson still number 1. He was held to a season-low 33 rushing yards, but tied Deshaun Watson with the ACC record 47 total touchdowns.
Turning to the NBA, no games on Thanksgiving to preview, but plenty to talk about with our own Rob Mahoney, who joins me now. Rob, let's start with Golden State. They're off to the start we all knew they were capable of. They're averaging 121 points per game, and they are clicking. Now, we asked all offseason, what would be the blueprint to beat the Warriors? Is that starting to reveal itself in any way? Is there any area where they look vulnerable?
Yeah, I think there are a few. And, it's a tricky thing because vulnerable is a challenging word when a team can just outscore you as well as the Warriors can. But there are a couple things I think the teams can do to give themselves a shot on a game-by-game basis. One, you don't want to be intimidated by their defense. We've seen the teams that have most effectively challenged the Warriors have been driving in hard, really challenging Golden State to protect the rim. And if Golden State is on one of those nights where its defense is a little lazy, where its switches aren't super clean, then you can make up some ground there. I think on the opposite side of the ball, you're really looking to make, as expected, Zaza Pachulia and Andre Iguodala in particular into finishers as much as possible. You want to overplay the perimeter really strong and then hope that they get flashy in terms of their passes, hope that they're dumping it into Zaza and making him a finisher in the lane, that Iguodala, who has looked really bad on his layups all season, is forced into some difficult shots. And then if you had the personnel to kind of bully the offensive glass, I think that's a strong way to go as well. Not every team can pull that off, but some of the strongest teams in the West can. So it'll be interesting to see how these teams go about matching up with the Warriors, but I think the blueprint is starting to kind of manifest.
All right, that's our gift to all the NBA head coaches out there. Next step is going out and executing. The Los Angeles Clippers are off to a hot start as well. We've seen this before, though, from the Clippers. Is there anything you are seeing that makes you believe this will not be another disappointing season?
Well, I think there is something to be said about a certain gestation period in terms of a certain core being together year after year after year, and what that does in particular for their defense, which is what we've seen, Blake Griffin in particular playing the best defense he's ever played. And when you have that in conjunction with, 2 All-NBA defenders in DeAndre Jordan and Chris Paul, another really great defensive player in the starting lineup in Luke Richard Mbah a Moute at the 3, and J.J. Redick, who's able to kind of hold his own and deal with some of those high leverage matchups where he's chasing guys all over the floor. They've really looked good in terms of their coverage. And I think that's something they can hold over the course of the year, in addition to the fact that, they've always been one of the most efficient offenses. When you have Chris Paul and Blake Griffin, you're basically guaranteed that so long as those guys are healthy. The question has been, can they put this together defensively? Can they have the bench play, which has looked much improved? It's fallen off a little bit lately, but it's still looking improved overall, both through internal development and some key additions. And can they get enough out of that, that 5th starter spot where Mbah a Moute has been so far? He's playing great D right now. He's making 44% of his threes, and he's doing some stuff off the dribble, which is something he really hasn't done in his career to date. And so the idea that the Clippers are getting all these things at the same time makes me think that something's a little bit different for them this year.
Let's stay in the Western Conference. Rob, you've written about the Utah Jazz, who narrowly missed the playoffs last season and were expected to make a big jump this year. So far, it's been anything but smooth. The team has dealt with various injuries, and they have a losing record. What makes you believe this team will live up to the new expectations?
Well, I think both last year's team and this year's team so far, as you mentioned, are better than their record shows. Right now the Jazz are below 500, and they're a team that's dealt with, significant injuries across their starting lineup, across their bench, and it's forced them to kind of contort in ways that, even though they went into their offseason hoping to add depth, hoping to kind of shore things up and prevent what happened last season from happening again, there's still going to be ways in which you're pinched, in which you're, when you're missing key players, key starters, guys like George Hill and Derek Favors in particular, and especially when you're missing multiple guys at the same time. And so I feel like as long as they can keep their heads above water, as long as they can kind of take care of business in some of these games against lesser teams and stick around, really kind of just hang in the thick of the Western Conference, that when some of those guys start trickling back into the lineup, they're going to see some big dividends. All the big markers right now in terms of point differential, in terms of, their overall play are still fine. It's just going to be a matter of getting everybody back and healthy so they can really make a strong push into, the mid to high 40s in terms of wins.
All right, flipping over to the Eastern Conference, the Greek freak Giannis Antetokounmpo turned in our adrenaline performance. It's presented by Toyota. Let's go places. His stat line, 21 points, 10 rebounds, 10 assists, 5 steals, 3 blocks. It's something only Hakeem Olajuwon and Michael Jordan have ever accomplished. Now, Rob, this is just one game, but from what you've seen, should Giannis be linked with this elite company?
Well, in terms of statistical output, he's one of those guys who's always going to put up some crazy, unusual lines. Combinations of assists and blocks or steals and rebounds, because he's so huge. He's playing in such a unique role in terms of kind of being a point forward there, really initiating a lot of offense. But he's so rangy defensively, and he covers such a wide, variety of opponents. He's going to have some crazy, crazy numbers over the course of his career. And to think that this is coming from a guy who's still figuring out not only his game, but, the ins and outs of running an offense on a day-to-day basis, the ins and outs of defense in a variety of capacities, in a variety of roles, still figuring out kind of how he manages certain situations. He's going to be really, really good for a long time. And, I don't think anybody's quite putting him in that, Hall of Fame kind of class just yet. In terms of statistical output, he's going to be an outlier for basically the rest of his career.
Rob Mahoney, appreciate your perspective. Rob, have a great Thanksgiving. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Maggie.
All right. Well, your fantasy football playoffs are quickly approaching. Here is our own Michael Beller with his best picks from the waiver wire.
Injuries to A.J. Green, Ryan Matthews, Darren Sproles, and LaShawn McCoy have helped create one of the most potentially lucrative waiver wires of the season. Grabbing one of their replacements could make all the difference for fantasy owners headed to the playoffs. Tyler Boyd takes over as the Bengals' nominal number 1 receiver with Green out because of a hamstring injury. The rookie out of Pittsburgh had his best game of the season after Green went down, catching 6 of 8 targets for 54 yards and a touchdown. Boyd generated some sleeper buzz during the summer, but that hadn't resulted in much of anything in the way of production until last week. With Green out, he'll be front and center in the Cincinnati offense. If you miss out on Boyd, Tyreek Hill is a nice fallback option. Hill has had the attention of the fantasy community for a few weeks, but he's still available in about 3 of every 5 leagues. He's serving capably as the Chiefs' number 1 receiver with Jeremy Maclin nursing a groin injury and has at least a touchdown or 89 yards in 3 of his last 5 games. The limitations of the Kansas City offense keeps Hill's rest of season ceiling at the wide receiver 3 level, but there's value in that for any owner fighting for a playoff spot, especially if you just lost A.J. Green. Hill is a worthwhile add this week. With Matthews and Sproles both suffering injuries in the Eagles' loss to the Seahawks last week, Wendell Smallwood could be on the verge of becoming a key player in Philadelphia. The rookie out of West Virginia has flashed when given a chance this season. He has 3 games with double-digit carries. In those 3 games, he has totaled 197 yards and a touchdown on 43 totes, good for 4.58 yards per carry. If Matthews and Sproles are out, Smallwood will be the feature back for the Eagles. LaShawn McCoy left last week's win over the Bengals with a thumb injury, possibly creating an opportunity for Mike Gillislee to get back in our lives. Gillislee ran for 72 yards on 14 carries against the Bengals, work he did almost wholly after McCoy left the game. He has just 56 rushes on the season, but has racked up 326 yards and 4 touchdowns, which comes out to more than 1 fantasy point per carry in standard scoring leagues. Gillislee can't possibly sustain that pace, but it speaks to how effective he has been and can be in a starting role. That'll do it for the waiver wire heading into week 12. I'll be back with you all later this week to talk stardom or sit-em. Until then, happy hunting on the wire.
After 5 years, U.S. Soccer has parted ways with Jürgen Klinsmann. The coach was under heavy scrutiny after the men's team recently lost to Mexico and Costa Rica in the span of 4 days. SI senior soccer writer Grant Wall joins me now with more. Grant, what can U.S. Soccer learn from this situation that they can apply moving forward? How do they find a long-term solution at coach?
Well, for right now, I think it's going to be sort of a medium-term solution, Maggie. Bruce Arena is set to be announced as the new U.S. men's national team coach in a return for Bruce Arena to that job that he held from 1998 to 2006. But the big question, I think, beyond Bruce Arena is beyond World Cup 2018. And right now, that's sort of up in the air what the U.S. will do at that point. I think one lesson that we've seen, though, is that it's probably smart not to go with the same coach for more than one World Cup cycle. That happened with Jürgen Klinsmann. It didn't work out. That happened with Bob Bradley. It didn't work out. That happened with Bruce Arena before that, and it didn't totally work out at the 2006 World Cup either. So I think it's really hard for a coach to keep his players' attention at the national team level for more than one World Cup cycle. Obviously, there are some exceptions like Germany's Jogi Löw, but he's the exception to the rule.
Yeah, Grant, why such a high burnout rate with this position?
I think it's a real high-pressure job. As Klinsmann found out, 2 games can take you from being pretty safe in your job to being out of a job. And so with so much pressure riding on a couple of 90-minute games, I think the stress levels are extremely high. The U.S. men's national team job is a very high-profile job at this point. And Klinsmann's a guy who had quite a bit of experience, but he couldn't avoid being fired in this situation. So Bruce Arena's been through this before. He's been through the pressures of World Cup qualifying and what's unique about doing that in Central America and Mexico and the Caribbean. So I know that's why U.S. soccer is going in Arena's direction right now.
Will the U.S. men's national team be better now that Klinsmann has been fired than they were?
I don't think anyone can say it with 100% certainty, but in my opinion, I think Arena right now can get more out of the same U.S. players that Klinsmann has had in recent games. I guarantee you Arena would not have lost 4-0 to Costa Rica last week, where it seemed like players quit on Jürgen Klinsmann. So that's going to be a big challenge here because Bruce Arena is known as a terrific man manager. Maybe not the most brilliant tactical guy, but really a terrific man manager whose teams have an identity. And those teams in the past were often greater than the sum of their parts. That's what he needs this U.S. team to be now as they head into those March qualifiers.
Grant, between the firing of Klinsmann and the 60 Minutes piece bringing widespread attention to the women's fight for equal pay, how would you describe the state of U.S. soccer right now?
Well, there's a lot of stuff going on, and obviously negatives on the men's side with Klinsmann getting fired and the reason for that. And on the women's side, they just need to figure out a collective bargaining agreement. The current one ends on December 31st. I feel like the 60 Minutes appearance and anything that is happening in terms of negotiations, it's all part of it for the CBA, for the U.S. women. And we'll see if they go on strike. Heading into 2017, that's a real possibility here. So U.S. soccer needs to stay on top of things here. And in many ways, there's still good things going on in U.S. soccer. And there's a ton of money in the federation right now. But you need to have your national teams moving in the right direction. And right now, there's a lot of turmoil.
We're keeping our eye on many storylines involving U.S. soccer. Grant Wall, thank you. We appreciate it, Grant. Have a great Thanksgiving. We'll talk to you soon.
You too.
All right. And that's going to do it for this episode of SI Now. We'll see you back here tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern when we'll be joined by the dancing duo, James Hinchcliffe and Sharna Burgess. You've been watching them give their behind-the-scenes updates all season long from Dancing with the Stars. They'll be in our studio. You won't want to miss that. But until then, stick with SI.com for all the latest news. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter at SI Now Live. Have a great afternoon. We'll see you tomorrow.